Hello, thanks for joining me today. My name is Audra, and I'm going to talk with you about Acts chapter 6, verses 1 through 7. In these verses, we're going to see some growing pains of the early church, but we're also going to see how they're solved. The early church continues to grow no matter what. No matter persecution, no matter if there's conflict, they are determined to continue to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. If you remember from my chapter 2 video called The Beginning of Unity, that even though the early church was unified, this did not mean that they were all meeting together. And this is very evident as we look at this chapter, at chapter 6, where a conflict comes because we have two groups who have two different worship style preferences, specifically two different language preferences. These two groups were the Hebraic Jews and the Hellenistic Jews. The Hebraic Jews primarily spoke Hebrew and Aramaic. They could speak some Greek, but again, remember, this is language preferences. On the other hand, we have the Hellenistic Jews, who primarily spoke Greek. The problem arises when the Hellenistic Jews say that their widows are not being cared for. Just to point out, there is no theological difference between these two groups, and we see that in the problem that comes up. There's no ethnic preferences, it's just simply language preference. But the Hellenistic Jews think that because they speak Greek, their widows speak Greek, that they are just not being looked after as much as they should. Word of this complaint gets to the 12, which are the apostles. And I love how the 12 solve the problem. They don't just let the complaint continue, but they kind of say, okay, if you're willing to bring out your complaints, if you're willing to verbalize, then we're going to need your help in the solution. So what the apostles do is they gather all the Hellenistic Jews together and they say, okay, in order to complete everything, we're going to need to delegate. We're going to need some assistance. So they poll the crowd, they ask for assistance, and they need 7 godly men to be in charge of the distribution of food and some other tasks. And so 7 men are volunteered and obviously have to volunteer themselves and be willing to help out. And they lay their hands on them, they pray for them, they commission them. And now we have the first, what we'll call deacons of the early church. And I love the ending of this section. If you'll look at Acts in verse 7, it says that because they brought in these helpers, the apostles continued to preach and teach, and the church grew even more. After these growing pains were fixed, if you will, the commentary said that the church grew at the very least to 5,000. It could have been closer to 10,000 just because things were restructured. This passage has so many important things for us to learn as we look at our current church. I think it's a great reminder that restructuring is necessary and important. If your church is growing, things need to change. Maybe if it's not growing, things need to change. When I was thinking of this, I was thinking of how when you have leftovers, you're going to put them in your refrigerator and you put them in Tupperware, and you're going to find a space. And what if your Tupperware is too big? You can't just throw it in there and hope that it's going to fit and not fall out when you open the door. You're going to move things around. You're going to restructure. And this is important for us to remember because, I don't know how things are going in your church right now, but maybe some restructuring is happening, or maybe it's about to happen, and that's okay. Another important thing to remember is that delegation is necessary. The 12 could not do everything. Your church staff cannot do everything. They need help. And so they found the 7, they commissioned them, they blessed them to go forward, and then things got accomplished. The 12, maybe they could have done everything, but it wouldn't have been done well. Sometimes delegation is necessary, but there also needs to be willing volunteers who will step in to help. And we see that in these verses as well, that the 7 came forward, agreed to do their job, and then did their job. And this helped with the growth of the church. My final comments on these verses is just to continually remind us that growth is okay. It may come with growing pains, but a growing church is good. It needs to happen. And so I want to encourage you today, what can you do to help the growth of your church? And maybe it's not more people. Maybe it's just growing in the depth of love for Jesus Christ. So I want to encourage you, pray for your staff. Pray for your deacons or your elders or whatever you have in place. If you don't have those roles, if you don't have deacons or elders, just pray that there would be people that surround your staff to help with what they need. And a personal challenge to you as well is if you're thinking, hey, you know what, I could probably help. I can help with my church, with the growth. I want to challenge you to not come up with an extra job, but to be bold and go to your staff and say, how can I help? What is your vision? What is your desire for growth? So just continue to serve, continue to fall in love with God, continue to be a part of your local church. And thanks for joining me today. See you next time.